Hello everyone. This is a discussion that I wanted to give with you around domestic violence for this week's online class. Domestic violence is an area that isn't a direct impact on children. So if we look at domestic violence as being between the adult partners in a relationship, then it's not something that is done to children, but is certainly something that adds to the emotional trauma, and even so far as in some cases to be considered post-traumatic stress that can occur for children. So I think that it's important for us to look at this piece and to think about it with a specific lens or a specific focus. And that focus is going to be, what responsibility do we have as early childhood educators when we're working with children who have experienced domestic violence, and what strategies and what skills do we need and do the children need in order to move forward with this part of their life that they can't escape. In Canada, the statistics are really quite startling, and in fact, we're not doing very well on the world stage with respect to domestic violence. We are currently being criticized by the United Nations, that provides the information about the rights of children, for not doing enough. So specifically, we are not tackling this problem to the extent that it needs to be tackled. One of the real problems with domestic violence or partner violence or family violence, depending on which literature you're reading, is that the Aboriginal people of Canada are left to their own with very little support, and many of you know or are aware or should be aware that there are many missing women in Aboriginal cultures that we're just not looking for. And so these families are under a whole stress that really impacts the ability of the children in those families to deal with the ongoing violence that they see. So this is a snapshot of violence in Canada, and it looks at all different kinds of things. So they've listed family violence as being something that impacts anyone within that family structure. So child maltreatment, and we've discussed that as child abuse, is listed here. And these are statistics from the government, and on a bigger scale you'll be able to look at them. These are from 2011, and as I've mentioned before, one of my frustrations is that all of the statistics that are published by Canada, the Government of Canada or Statistics Canada, they take so long for them to be crunched down and put into percentages and graphs and numbers that they're never really as current. So 25% of all police reported violent crimes in Canada in 2011 were to deal with family violence. 32% would be child maltreatment. We, in our course, have discussed this as child abuse. Intimate partner violence would be, again, looking at domestic violence that happens between the adult members. Aboriginal women are mentioned, 2 times greater risk. And then it also looks at men and women and the percentages there. So the last piece that we don't consider particularly in our course, because we are working with children, is elder abuse. But elder abuse is something that's quite happens in Canada. So in a great family, in a family where there is not violence, there's equality in how the partnerships work. And this fluctuates over time and can be at different levels at different times. But the idea is here that there's this balance, there's this respect and mutual goals that a couple would have, same-sex or not. And so in these cases, there's a partnership, and the partnership is successful because of the things like trust, support, respect. There's not threatening behavior by one or the other partners. When there are issues, they're negotiated, and it's with a fairness. There's not a hidden agenda. Economic partnership means that the finances, if not contributed equally, are shared equally. That perhaps a partner stays home to look after children and the other partner works. The economic partnership is in place because both people have agreed to it. So that comes under the idea of a shared accountability, a shared responsibility for not only the relationship, but for the family. They're responsible in how they parent with each other, and they're honest and accountable. Now, those are the kinds of families that we strive to have, to strive to be part of, that we see that work best for children, and you can see why. It's the same kinds of attributes that we look for in teachers and we look for in children to cultivate these areas, and we do that through all of our work in the guidance area around respect and partnerships, negotiation, fairness. So you should be recognizing a lot of the same words that we've used in the guidance course. So back on this wheel, that's where some of those behaviors start to come across as really being the incident. Quite often then, the person who has committed the incident feels horrible. They've lost control. They promise to never do it again. They promise that they will get help. They promise, please stay. They promise that it will never happen again. And those promises are made probably with really good intention and really honest hopes. But the problem is that eventually the cycle repeats. After the reconciliation, things calm down. The initial incident is not forgotten perhaps, but pushed back. And it's referred to as a honeymoon phase, where people get along, they seem to be really happy with each other, and they seem to be so in love, and any doubts that you have about that relationship as being one of abuse seem to disappear, and it's very confusing. But then, because it is a cycle, tensions start to build again, and the cycle repeats. So once the tensions become unbearable, an incident will happen, reconciliation, the family will calm for a period of time, and the tensions build again. And when domestic abuse becomes really dangerous is when this cycle becomes so closely knit that there's not much time between tension building and incident, and reconciliation just gets, oh, I'm sorry, get over it, and the calm pieces are shorter and shorter and shorter, and eventually you're moving back between tensions building and the incidents, and domestic violence then becomes not only a dangerous situation, but becomes a life-threatening situation. And it isn't often until this time that the partner who is the victim in this situation has the courage to leave, because they are starting to recognize there won't be a reconciliation and there won't be a calmness. One of the things that's really important for us to get our head around, while most of the violence that happens in relationships happens to a woman from a man, domestic violence does not discriminate. So the statistics that are collected in Canada, the actual evidence in terms of anecdotal evidence, stories told, conveyed conversations happen, and it demonstrates very clearly that while most of the abuse happens between men who abuse women, it also happens with women who abuse men. And in this case, it's very difficult for those men who have been abused to come forward in a public situation, because so many of them are feeling that they are less than a man. They're made to feel weak. And so it's a hidden area of abuse that is coming more to the forefront. But we have to be aware of that, and children will see that. Same-sex partners, whether it's two women living together or two men living together, there's usually a lot of pride around gay pride. And in this case, I love this little saying with the heart: there is no pride in domestic violence. And to think that just because it's two women or two men that the abuse can't happen is really mistaken, because it's not really about men and women, it's about power. And while males have historically held most of the power in cultures, and that gives them certain economic advantages and political and societal advantages, it doesn't preclude the idea that it's about power. It's not about one sex being stronger than the other. It's about the power they have within that relationship. Regardless, the discrimination of whether it's man against woman, woman against man, woman against woman, or man against man, there is a great impact on children. In fact, this one organization says for a child, domestic violence lasts a lifetime. This is a traumatic event in a child's life, and they do have post-traumatic symptoms from it. It is horrifying. It is extremely scary for children. The two people that they rely on most in life are violent towards each other. One of them may be badly hurt. One of them may be telling the children that the parent is useless. And when you watch the videos that I have for you to choose from in this segment, you'll be able to hear some of the reasons that people do or don't leave and the things that happen to make that situation a very dangerous situation for not only the partner but for the children. Sorry about the barking in the background. That is my lovely dog. That keeps worrying. Sexual stereotyping, which I think is probably one of the most easily recognizable, where you see or hear young children saying that my mother's stupid, or women are dumb, or men are weak, or any of those kinds of stereotypical kinds of phrasings that put a lot of anger and violence in the tone of voice that children use, and inappropriate things that they're obviously taking from somewhere else and becoming part of who they are. So these are some of the effects, and we'll look at them a little bit more in a few more slides. So not all children are going to experience the same way. Not all children experience anything the same way as other children, and even within the same family. So if we think about a child called It, while the abuse was not domestic between parent and well, she was really rather nasty to her husband, but it wasn't a physical kind of abuse, and it was certainly emotional abuse that she put him through. So there was family violence, but one of the children and then another as time went on were certainly exposed to much greater results from the domestic situation, while others didn't seem to have the same kind of experience, didn't seem to have the same lasting effects. So within the same family, children can experience differently. And you should be able to, at this point of your early childhood career, understand why. Children develop differently, they have different personality types, they have different temperaments, and you spend a lot of time looking at temperaments. They have different learning styles, different abilities in the emotional and social areas of development. So how they internalize or deal with violence can be very different. Some of the things that children face in a violent home are hearing the threats. They can build the tension. Now, I know whether you're from a family that's a beautiful, healthy family or one that's experienced some difficulties, we were all really aware of when our parents' relationship was a little off, when partners in the family, when anyone in the family was angry, and children pick up on that. And so the tension that builds in that cycle of abuse that we looked at earlier is now something that the children can feel. They know when the tension's building. They're waiting for the angry burst. They can be threatened if they're young children or hurt accidentally. They can see or hear assault on their mother and or father. Being denied care because the person who's been injured is so depressed, is not able to physically look after them. Being forced to watch or participate. And it's again saying against their mother, but remember that's the majority of cases. There are cases where they're asked to be violent against their father. Seeing the aftermath of their parent, male or female, cut and bloodied and crying and upset and fearful. Having their relationships with their non-violent parent undermined. So how do you have a great healthy relationship with your mother or your father who will then turn around and hurt their other parent? How does a child trust that relationship? Being taken hostage. There are cases about this, and you read them in the newspapers and you see them on the news, where one child will be stolen by a parent and taken out of the province to a different country. And this is part of that violence campaign. Being enlisted by the parent to line up against the other one, to say, you're an awful parent, you're an awful person, I'm telling everyone that you're an awful stupid person. And sometimes the violence becomes so dramatic, so much more than what someone's mental health can bear, that the parent, the partner who has been hurt, who has had the violence done to them, commits suicide. Or the parent, in a rage, kills the other parent. And then the children are left with a devastated family and years of not being able to make sense of what happened. So they then may become a referee in the arguments, hearing parents argue and trying to go in and settle things and keep things calm, trying to break into the arguments so that there is less likely to be a violent eruption. Or they could become the scapegoat. If the parent who is the abused parent successfully leaves the home, then the parent who was the abuser can now turn their anger at times towards a child, and quite often towards the child who was their confidant or their caretaker beforehand. Gender affects it too. We can't escape. We talk about environment and gender all the time in our classes, and we can't escape the fact that gender does impact, especially when we're looking at domestic violence areas, because there are role expectations and there are stereotypical expectations for what it means to be a boy and a girl, and what you see your role model doing or being victimized by definitely impacts how you internalize that. So a young boy watching his father beat his mother may think that's how men behave. It also may be very upsetting to that boy because he loves his mother. So there's a very different way that children can internalize. Girls will often look to try and solve the problem. They want their family to be peaceful and happy. They want the father who they adore to stop hurting their mother. They want their mother to look after them, to make things okay. Developmental stage impacts here as well. As you can imagine, a child in their teens has the cognitive ability and the life experience to be able to think about what's happening in their family and to be able to distance themselves or to have friends or outside influences that could help them make sense of what's happening. A very young child, an infant, has no one but their parents. A preschool child doesn't have the outlets or the experience or the confidence or the language to be able to get help. And we saw that in both Failing Jeffrey's case, although it wasn't domestic violence, but we saw the lack of language and the lack of oversight and how that child's age played into the kinds of things that were able to happen to them. We also see it in A Child Called It, when the school child is ignored and it's not noticed, and they don't seem to have the voice that needs to come forward to say there's violence happening in my home. Children are often sworn to secrecy about what happens at home. We've all heard what happens behind closed doors stays behind closed doors. And now we're saying those doors need to be thrown open, and we need to be able to take some steps to help these families and especially these children. It impacts, again, then, is the child's age. And as I briefly mentioned, the more immature or young a child is, the more important or harmful that impact and lasting that impact may be. And that's simply because it's been a pattern that's been ingrained in the brain. And we've talked about brain development and how the brain continues to develop it through those early years when language acquisition and problem solving and critical thinking skills are there developing. And so if there is violence and uneasiness and fear and isolation and intimidation that's happening in the home, that can have a great impact. We can see these warning signs that can lead us to know when this kind of violence is taking place. Children may complain, like they do with all the other forms of abuse, of physical aches and stomach aches. We know from last semester in guidance class, looking at what stresses children and how they deal with stress, that those are symptoms of stress, and domestic violence is certainly stressful. Problems with attendance, especially if they had been attending regularly, and that can happen for a number of reasons. The children aren't staying in the home, so they're not attending school. The children are trying to care for the parent who's been hurt. The parent that's been hurt can't take them to school. The parent who abused has left the situation for a little while before reconciliation and that calm period of time. Unexplained changes in behavior or grades. That, again, is a generalized indicator of something not being right with a child. It can be the abuse of the child themselves or the impact of the other kinds of abuse that they may have been witnessed or been affected by. Unexplained bruises or injuries, and we could see this happening with domestic violence, where a child perhaps receives accidental injury because they've got between the parent who was abusing and the parent who was the victim. Coming to school very tired, children will often stay on guard to listen to see if there's going to be an escalation, especially if they're aware of the tension, see if there's going to be an incident. They might talk about being afraid and think that something's bad going to happen in their families or in their lives. So we should listen to those things. New disciplinary or aggression problems, they may be taking out their frustration and fear and isolation and just devastating confusion out on other children in terms of outbursts of anger. And we know this because about the self-regulation skills that children have and how it takes so much time for children to build a way that works to control their own emotions and the emotions of their adult parent. Their own emotions of responding in this situation can be so big, so extreme that they can't control their own behavior. Their self-regulation is decreasing, so we see more outbursts. They don't want to go home. Who would want to go home when they know that there could be a violent interaction that comes next? Even if it's not directed towards them, there is a dreadful feeling that happens when children are exposed to that kind of violence in their home. And stereotypical beliefs about gender. And again, we've talked about this a bit, or I've mentioned a bit about it in this presentation, but often it's male roles as the stronger, keeping people in line, and women are useless and weak and victims. But it can be the other way. It's not as nearly as common, but it can be. So I want to caution you against the stereotypical thinking that all domestic violence is men against women. 90% or more, and that's not a statistical fact, but a large proportion of the domestic violence we see, the largest proportion is women are as victim, man as perpetrator, for some of the reasons around power and economic control that they may have in the relationship still today in 2016. So this has just been a brief overview and some information about domestic violence. You're going to move on now to the next part of our online class. You can go back and review this and play it again if you wish. You can go to the slides and look more carefully at the statistical information, but I think it gives you a good beginning and an overview of why we look at domestic violence in a course about child abuse.